population. Around 1800, I know it's been a long time ago, under the Austrian and Hungarian monarchy, the area became Germanized. You can tell by my accent that it was still went on when I was born. Some of these German Jews started to move out from the old Jewish area to inhabit other parts of the city. With the beginning of Theodor Herzl's Zionism and Tikva, hope of Eretz Israel, the situation evolved and Chernovitz became a draw for Jewish aspirations as well as culture, philosophy, medicine, and science. By the 1900s, 1/3 of the population in Chernovitz was Jewish. That is quite something because basically the Jews were the doctors, philosophers, teachers, and a very great university. During the time between the two world wars, secular schools of education began limiting the participation of Jews by providing quotas or maximum allowances, and these Jewish children were discriminated against through required humiliating cleanliness checks. Discrimination also occurred during daily business practices between Jews and non-Jews. You know, I kind of experienced that myself later on in Austria, being pointed out or something like that, even though after the Second World War. Okay. This is a photo of my family store in Chernovitz. Well, it's a building. My father owned the building which housed the store on the street level and apartments over the store. We lived in a large apartment there along with my maternal grandmother Sophia. Several other family members also lived in the same apartment building. I still remember the name of the street and all that, but I was a little kid at that time. The store, originally started by my grandfather, also named Kalman, was a grocery store. However, my father turned it into a thriving dry goods store where other members of our family and locals were employed. I remember playing with some of my cousins who were all older and whose parents in 1939 decided to move to Palestine. My father, who was also an attorney and had a degree in Jewish studies, for some reason did not believe that he should flee his city when Jews began to be targeted. His reasoning was that he was an officer in the Austrian military during the First World War and felt that he would not be touched. You know, situations where Jews were used, best way to describe it is to say that we are used to people hate us. So we kind of don't, I'm talking about at that time, and we kind of don't pay much attention when something nasty is being said. So we figured, well, I'll overcome it anyhow. I do remember attending the main temple during high holidays. There were more than one temple. There were hundreds, I wouldn't say hundreds, but maybe 50 temples during the high holidays. And in general, my mother, father, and I had a wonderful life. I had my two grandmothers, and I brought along a siddur, having belonged to Malka, my grandmother, with the Hebrew prayers translated into Yiddish. Yes. As you can see, her name is Kalman Held, right on the cover. And this happens to be the Yom Kippur siddur. It's in Hebrew and in Yiddish. Who can read it in Yiddish?
Can we pass it around?
Certainly. I remember every Friday night as a little kid, we were invited to my grandmother Malka's home, who served us chilled water on a very beautiful porcelain plate with marmalade. To me, it was quite something, but it's been a long time ago. Well, that's my mother and father when they were married. That would have been 1933, 1934. And guess who that is? That's me. I think I was 10 months old, and it tells you 10th July 1936. That's my other grandmother, Sophia, my mother, and I had some real skinny legs, okay? See, there's a passport from 1938. It's in Romanian, and not much to say about it. And that's my father, mother, and I before the war. Yeah, none of us knew what was going on. As a result of the previously broken treaty between Germany and Russia, you see, Germany and Russia had a treaty between 1939 and 1940 where they actually were cooperating, so they said, you can be here and I'll be here, etc., etc. So, of course, that was broken in 1940. As a result of the previously broken treaty between Germany and Russia, the war started in our area in 1940 with the invasion of the Russians. They took over the town and the province. It was at that time that my father and others were arrested and put in jail. I was young when my father was taken away and vaguely remember hearing my relatives speaking about it. Also, much of what happened to him after he was taken away was told to me years later by relatives. Somehow he was able to send letters to our family members in Palestine asking for help and money. My mother and I did not know of the existence of the letters until years later when we arrived in Palestine. I moved a little, not here. Okay, it's going to come up. My father Gustav, his Hebrew name was Gershon, was taken away because he was considered a bourgeois. What's a bourgeois?
Upper class.
Yeah, somebody real rich, somebody who is on the board over there at the school. I looked at some of the names. Okay. And did not meet their working class standards. My mother visited the jail and brought him food and tried to have him released, but to no avail. One day, probably 2 weeks into his arrest, my mother went to visit and found my father gone. My father and many others like him were deported and marched into Russia, where he ended up in a village called Rossosh. And that's what it is. This is a village of Rossosh, the way we figured it out. The reason I say that is because, just like Atlanta, there's several Atlantas in the United States. There might be more than one village, but to the best of our knowledge, this was a village that's relatively close to Moscow. My father was older than most other people that may have been taken on a march, and some of them may or may not have joined the Russian army, but my father was too old for that, and he was just dropped off. That's the way we figured it out. Where's Yad Vashem?
That's the Yad Vashem.
Oh, I see. It's from that map. Okay. So he was walked, however it was, all the way there.
How many miles was that, do you know?
Pardon?
How far is that?
I don't know, it could be like 800 miles or something like that. I know this much from the letters he sent to our family members in Palestine asking for help and money. Remember I told you about my family members that had been to Palestine in 1939. And my father stayed with a poor Jewish family in Rososh for a short time, but they weren't able to keep him because of lack of extra food and who knows what other circumstances. Now, this is all in Hebrew. The letters are Hebrew. The words are all in German. So, you know, his letters were written in German, but using Hebrew letters. He was obviously concerned about wrong eyes prying into his contents. Basically, my Palestine family sent money to the nearest British consulate. Much of Russia was occupied by the Nazis already, but as you know, there were other areas that were not. And there obviously were several consulates there, British consulates, but we really do not know that he picked up the money or that he didn't. We most likely think that he did not, he wasn't able to. I later learned that my father received some help and was planning to try and get back to us, but he did not make it. I do not know the date, where and under what circumstances he perished. He would have been 48 years old, and while years later I tried to obtain information through the Red Cross, none came through. Now, you should know, I actually translated this. It's not that easy to see it on the screen, but I'll give you some. Habe ich weiter nichts verstanden. So this is Yiddish, but it's German really. I also remember standing in line for bread when the Russian soldiers, just like Ukrainians, they really loved us, had done, opened their rifles and showed us, the Jews standing in line, the bullets that they indicated are meant to us, for us. That was in 1940. In 1941, the situation again changed for the worse, and the Nazis captured the city from the Russians, and the circumstances became severe. We were evicted from our apartment and were living in a shack with no indoor plumbing on the outskirts of the city. There are several letters that my father sent, and I have them. And that's all I have. Okay. How do you like that ordinance? It's translated into English, but that's what it was. We, Alexander Riozano, as an authorized representative general, Ion Antonescu for administration of Bukovina decree. It was a dictatorship in Romania at the time, and they were all buddies with the Russians. So the Romanians actually ran the show to some degree, and this is what the Jews were not permitted to do, because everything here says what they are not permitted to do. The edict to wear the yellow star came down, and my grandmother and my mother were sewing yellow stars to our clothing. And we were to wear them anytime we were on the street, which we did. As many others in the city were being deported to forced labor camps in nearby Transnistria, Ukraine, my mother knew we were in grave danger. I was told to use my best German when approached on the street, which was the only language I knew. Speaking of my mother, which was the only language I knew, I knew a few words in Romanian, but I'm supposed to speak German, and so that they know that we are, just give an impression that we are more like them. Speaking of my mother, she was born in the Danube River town of Brăila. Need to go back there. Sorry. That's it. Here's Brăila. In other words, from here to here. So the three of us, mother, maternal grandmother, and I, took, I think, a horse-drawn carriage and also a train and wound up in Brăila, her place of birth, where we spent maybe 1 year. You must be wondering how we managed to do this. We were a family of means, and my mother obviously had managed to hide funds and jewelry. Since my mother was born and raised in Brăila and knew her way around, we pretended not to be Jewish. No yellow stars. We lived across the street from a Romanian military camp, and I still remember the cries at night when the officers were beating the soldiers. The Romanian army was known not as a very strong army and very bad. Compared to where we had come from, for me, it was not really a bad time, because while at age 7 I still did not go to school, I had made some friends and did not realize the dire circumstances the adults were experiencing in trying to find a way out. The goal of my mother and grandmother was to try and to get to Palestine. Obviously, she found a way, and in 1943, we made our way by train to Bucharest, the capital of Romania. Bucharest. From there, we could attempt to escape via boat from one of the port cities on the Black Sea. There were many Jews living in Bucharest, and somehow we got by. I did have my mother's younger sister, Jenny, who resided in Bucharest for a long time and was married. She helped us as best as she could by securing a room for us to live in. Scarlet fever was all around, and my mother caught it. I also fell ill with scarlet fever and was sick for months and almost did not survive it. You see, scarlet fever is not a big deal today. It was a big deal then because there were no antibiotics. My grandmother was sick with a heart condition and passed away. Food became even more scarce. My uncle, Zygmunt, my father's brother, and along with his wife Tilly and 4-year-old daughter Pnina, also arrived in Bucharest from Czernowitz. While there, in front of my uncle and young cousin, my Aunt Tilly was shot and killed. It had a profound, lasting effect on me. Romania supplied the Nazi machinery with fuel from its oil wells in Ploiești, and the Germans obviously needed to control the country in order to fuel their machinery. Ploiești. You see how close it is to Bucharest. This is Ploiești. Bucharest was being bombed by the Allies, and the sky became dark with bombers flying towards the oil wells, but also were dropping bombs on Bucharest. I remember sometimes you see during bombings where women were putting up the children to have, when trucks with military soldiers went out, asking the soldiers to take the babies away because the bombing was so bad. I remember sitting on the grass in the park and seeing the destruction all around me. My mother later told me that I would nervously grab handfuls of grass around me and cry in fear. Several weeks before departing for the port city of Constanța, we moved into a large apartment that we shared with other families who were also trying to get to Palestine. The conditions were crowded, people slept on chairs, there was a room used for teaching the children. It was the first time that I was ever in a classroom, even though it was only makeshift. We were taught the Hebrew alphabet. Obviously, there was still a functioning Jewish committee which assisted those who wanted to escape to Palestine and elsewhere. Just as an aside, many Jews in Romania were taken to concentration camps. But this was Romania. You could get by if a little bit. Some people were very lucky. If you had money, you could have protectors and you had all kinds of situations. I absolutely do not remember wearing a yellow star in Bucharest. On a clear day in the spring of 1944, I was on a train with my mother and two of my uncles and their families headed toward the border of Constanza, the harbor of Constanza on the Black Sea to board a boat that would be part of our journey to Palestine. This is the Black Sea over here, and this is this harbor of Constanza. It is also the delta for the river Danube. And a lot of tourist boats go there today. So we boarded a rickety Bulgarian boat. Bulgaria was a neutral country during the war. There is a story, and it's a true story, that the king of Bulgaria did not allow, it was a neutral country, but the Nazis were there, did not allow the Jews that were living in Bulgaria to be taken away by the Nazis. So we boarded a boat overloaded with many refugees. It was overcrowded and stuffy below deck, so we spent most of the time on the deck, even when it rained. Food was scarce and we were given bread, soup and water. When on deck, we had to watch when the sail had to be shifted in order not to be thrown overboard. Yes, the boat had an engine as well, but it did not always work and the crew had to really watch everything due to the warships passing through. Well, you don't see the whole Black Sea and Turkey right around here. After about 4 days, we laid anchor in Constantinople. Do you know what Constantinople is? Okay. Today is Istanbul, Turkey. Turkey was a neutral country at that time, but its government initially favored Germany. We were not allowed off the boat, with little food, the adults were bartering whatever possessions they had with the Turkish merchants, arriving in little boats for food and cigarettes. I know that this particular boat hit a mine on a later trip and everyone on board perished. From what I can remember, we stayed on the docked boat for about a week. Finally, the Turkish government granted permission for us to disembark. We then boarded a cattle train, and this name you would remember, to Aleppo, Syria. The train had straw on the floor and side railings to hold on, and it smelled terrible. After about a day's trip, we arrived in Aleppo, Syria, which was already under British control. In other words, the Allies were there. Times were... Yes. We were deloused with DDT, today's a forbidden pesticide. Remember, we smelled and maybe a little lice. We were showered, given food, and stayed overnight. In the morning, we were trucked into Palestine, near Haifa, and as we were illegal immigrants, placed in a camp enclosed with wire fencing called Adlit. This is the same camp where years later Egyptian prisoners of war were kept by the IDF, the Israeli army. However, life was much better, food was provided, and we stayed in cottages, and the adults cooked. I remember everyone reading the newspapers, and since most did not speak or read Hebrew, the newspapers were in German, and I clearly remember the paper they printed on was pink. The reason for that is there was a scarcity of paper. The British began registering everyone interned in the Adlit camp and then issuing identification papers and releasing them. We stayed in the camp about 3 weeks before we were issued our identification papers and released. We moved to a room in an apartment that we rented from another family. My mother, who had used all her funds to get us here, needed to work and found a job at a hotel and then in a factory. The war was still going on, and the British who were in charge decided to stop allowing refugee immigrants into the country and sent arriving boats to internment camps in Cyprus. That was a big deal over quite a few years, and people suffered. Many boats from France and Italy were coming with immigrants, and they were all pushed back into Cyprus in internment camps as if they didn't have enough with the concentration camps. I was one of the first few children from anywhere in the war zone to arrive in Israel prior to the end of World War II. I was placed in 3rd grade in Tel Aviv and had difficulty adjusting since I had no basis of experience, having missed 1st and 2nd grades. This may surprise you. Israel is a great country today. Everything is beautiful over there. We have some issues and elections are coming up, but we don't talk about that. The thing is, you realize that the locals at the time didn't have any real knowledge of what was going on, and there were no situations where children had to be taken in and things were to explain to them. You just expected them to be like they are, which I wasn't. Times were hard for my mother, and she thought that I would adapt better, so she arranged for me to stay and learn on a kibbutz called Shfaim, where I stayed for 3 happy years. I give up.
No, keep going. You missed those.
Oh,
It's you.
you see a happy guy, that's me.
I've never seen that picture.
I'm not talking about my experience at the kibbutz, but I can tell you it was really good. I went to school during the morning hours, and the next is coming up here, what I did in the afternoon. But this particular kibbutz had no grades. I will tell you the truth. What happened was that I was so bad that they called my mother and said that they couldn't keep me. Now remember, there were no grades because I couldn't learn anything. So what happened was, in the summertime, I studied the library over there. And come the next year, I was teaching some of the kids that were born there how to read in Hebrew. I remember that on one particular evening, all of the kids and adults went to the beach, which was about a mile away, to receive illegal immigrants stepping off an incoming boat. We quickly switched clothes with the arriving children and adults and hurried back to the kibbutz. The British came to the kibbutz and naturally asked for IDs from those who were dressed as if they just came off the boat. Well, we certainly provided our IDs to them and were able to help the new immigrants who we had hidden in buildings around the complex and then dispersed to different locations. I missed something here. In the afternoon, my job was to fertilize the vegetables, and sometimes we also fertilized with stuff, cow urine. When I say you had to take heavy showers, believe me, you had to take very heavy showers. But it was all okay. We had plenty of food. It was very nice. We had, okay, here it is. We had to work the field in the afternoon. I'll skip that. The year 1948 was the beginning of the War of Independence, and there was a dirt field next to the kibbutz. We were clearing the field of stones when I was present for the arrival of a private plane from the US. Adults were pulling out the seats to clear the interior. Then they drilled a hole in the belly of the plane, and 4 adults, two on each side, sat down each with a bomb in their hands. The plane took off with the people inside, and upon its return, we were told that they had dropped the bombs on Sfat. I asked what damage was done, and was told that it was not much, but that the noise made the Arabs run away, clearing the area for our own people to take over the city. As an aside, my diligent work clearing the field allowed me to later have my first joyride on a plane. I will tell you a story about that too. You know, we were not permitted to take any kind of joyrides on the planes because we made friends with the pilots. Well, you know, I did have a joyride. And each kibbutz has a water tower. And every kibbutz has a security guy, of course. And as a matter of fact, the security guy, we used to use Morse code to communicate with other kibbutzim or any other locations in the area. And we were always used to standing up there and to see the Morse code being practiced. However, I was having dinner one night and minded my own business when the security officer came by and lifted me by my collar. He said, "You were on a plane." I said, "No such thing." He said, "Listen, I was on a water tower and I saw you." Anyhow, it happens. My mother remarried in 1948. My stepfather was a widower, and I suddenly had 2 brothers, Danny and Ilan, and a couple of years later, my sister Ariella was born. I was back in Tel Aviv going to high school. However, at age 16 and a half, I was sent by my parents to complete my education in Austria. I had an aunt and uncle there on my mother's side and attended a specialized hospitality school in Vienna. This uncle and aunt were in hiding in Belgium during the war. I cared dearly for my relatives there, but did not wish to adjust to the type of new anti-Semitism which had sprouted and emigrated all alone to Canada at age 18, where I landed in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I had about a year of adjustment working in Montreal and then resort hotels in the province of Quebec, and eventually married my wife, who is from Miami. We stayed in Canada for several years and then moved on to the States, where I was initially employed by Marriott. Okay, I read it, but I'll tell you, there is a lot more. I didn't tell you about the kibbutz. We had our own dining room for the kids, and breakfast was a great deal. You had salads and eggs and everything, and lunch wasn't very much, and then you had dinner. It was quite a time which I wasn't used to. We grew oranges. I was a specialist on using seeds, planting for watermelons, stuff like that. Actually, it was a wonderful time. I also had the experience of meeting the first foreign minister of Israel who came to visit. His name was Moshe Shartok. He changed his name to Sharet, and he asked us if we have any suggestions to him, foreign minister. And I simply said, take care of everything and bring everybody in. So, I'm done. If you have any questions, I'll sit down and answer it. And if you don't have any questions, that's okay too. Yes, ma'am.
What did you do when you weren't working on the kibbutz? What did you do for fun?
Well, we had chagigot. We would sing, learn how to sing. We were having a lot of sports, kadurregel, soccer. We would go on trips. We sometimes went long ways. We were walking, and you had to wear long pants because if not, you got sunburned, and you wound up in a hospital. One time we went from over there all the way to Yagur, which is a little bit northeast of Haifa. And at that one time, we actually tried to be friends with the Arab kids and invited some of them to stay with us. You know, in the early time in the kibbutz, we also, if you were under 8 years old, you could go and visit the Arab villages, and because if you did not allow anybody over 8 years old to be among the women. And I remember one thing very clear, where I went to a home, nice homes, and each bedroom was painted a different color, and one bedroom was actually black. So we asked, I didn't speak Arabic, but why is this Arabic? Why is this bedroom painted black? And I don't know that it was a joke or not, and I'm not going to say it, but he said, this is the least favorable wife for that particular Arab guy. But what did we do in the kibbutz? I saw the Palmach training. You know what Palmach means? That was the original group of people that trained prior to it becoming the Israeli army. There were no weapons. They were training with sticks, how to fight. And I remember the code that they were using, which was saying, Telem Chamor Shomer Echad. It was just a code. Also, talking about Romania, when the War of Independence started, Israel did not have any weapons. And while Romania was a communist country at the time, the foreign minister of Romania was a woman by the name of Anna Palker. And she arranged for a lot of weapons from Romania to get to Israel at the time. And I remember that the bullets did not quite fit the Enfield rifles that were British. So if you wanted to shoot, you had to stick a little bit of paper into the bullet before you stuck it into the rifle in order to be able to shoot. I mean, today, people would laugh at those things, but at the time, that was a very serious issue. Yes, young lady.
How did you meet your wife?
We would have to take more time than that for that. No, I'll tell you.
His mother introduced.
They were
Yeah, that's right. What does she do?
They've been married for 55 years. 55. You've been married for 55 years.
Yeah.
56.
So yeah, she is very pretty. She was very pretty even then, and I invited her to come. I was actually running a hotel in Toronto, and my mother saw her when they visited Miami, and we invited her to come. So she came, and I met her, and that was it. About 6 months later, I finally went to visit Miami, but I was independent. My parents had nothing to do with it, so my mother never knew what was going on about things like that. And when we called and told her that I was engaged to my wife, my mother asked, to whom? Because she had no idea, so you can say that. Anyhow, that's the answer. Any other questions? Yes?
Why did your parents send you to high school in Austria?
All right. That is a very good, very important question. After all the stuff that my mother experienced, she wasn't doing well. She had problems of a mental nature. And my stepfather, who meant well, and he may not have he meant well, wanted me to be out, to be away from her. And that's what really happened.
How many languages can you speak?
Well, or what?
Tell the truth.
I can speak French, I can speak German is my native tongue, I certainly can do Hebrew, I can do pretty well in Italian, and I do Romanian. So,
It's amazing, isn't it? It's always been like that.
but the thing is, sometimes, you know, this is very funny, I went to a store, and this woman, I could tell by her accent that she was Romanian, and she was talking English. So I responded in Romanian, and that really, she was so shocked she couldn't say anything because, but anyhow, let's talk about what really happened. So ask me questions about what I showed you, whatever you want.
When you were able to go around without a yellow star, were you still afraid? And how did you feel even as a young kid, you know, when you'd seen that, German soldiers?
I did not see many German soldiers. What I did see a lot was Romanian and Ukrainian soldiers, which is frankly just as bad. They looked down on me. When I did not, you asked when I did not have a yellow star,
Yeah, when you were able to go without a yellow star, were you still afraid? And especially when you saw the soldiers?
in Brela I was not afraid at all. In Bucharest there were different situations because Bucharest was basically, you see, okay, that's a wonderful question. Romania was part of the Nazi Axis, and it was run by a dictator by the name of Antonescu, and they were anti-Jewish and everything else. But there was a very young king called Michael. He was 18 years old, and the king in 1944 stood up and fired Antonescu and his government and actually asked for the Allies to take over. So what happened was that the military basically turned around and were friendly to the Allies, and then that's when the Nazis really started shooting everybody and all that. They were no longer concerned about Jews, they were concerned about staying there because of the fact that the oil wells were there, and they needed to keep Romania in their hegemony. So it was a different time, and you know, I said that we learned the Hebrew alphabet. We also learned something else, to say something in Romanian, long live King Michael I, because how do you think the Jewish committee was able to send us to the harbor to take a boat? You had to have money, but the point is, they allowed us to do it because if they didn't want to, they would have killed us right there in Bucharest or wherever they wanted to. So we used to say, Trăiască Majestatea sa Regele Mihai I, long live His Highness the King Michael I. This king lived a long time. Of course, he was kicked out when the communists took over, but he lived in Switzerland a long life, and he only passed away maybe a year or two ago. I hope I answered.
Didn't you say there were
get
times?
diverted when I answered.
Didn't you say there were times where you didn't even know there was a problem?
Yes. I mean, being a kid, and since I did not, the only time I wore a yellow star was in Chernobyl, not in Bucharest, certainly not in Brela. And you just got by, but you really had to know somebody, pay him off if possible, pay him off. The reason why my aunt was killed was because somebody didn't like them, period. And that was a terrible thing, a very terrible thing. But on the other hand, I'll tell you something, because that's happening very often nowadays. Okay, I told you about this lady that I liked very much. She did something when I was a kid that I could never forget, something good. She was killed. She was a wonderful lady. I remember it. So her widower, who was my uncle, was a widower for a long time, but then he married a very fine lady who was from Poland, who was a concentration camp survivor, but she was allowed to go to Sweden, and she had always a Swedish flag in her home because she respected the fact that they saved her. She was a wonderful lady. So my cousin Pnina had children too. And you know what? The kids never knew that this lady was not really their true grandmother. And this hurt me, but in Israel, some people tend to forget the whole thing and don't want to know about it. So in effect, my cousin's children and their kids do not even know that they had a real grandmother that I visited I visited the cemetery in Bucharest much later, and my grandmother is also married over there. I visited this lady's grave in the cemetery. Talking about the cemetery, in Bucharest, it's miles and miles. They separated between the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi cemeteries. I've never in my life seen such a large cemetery with some of the stones turned over, but not because it's because of age, not because anybody went there and tried to turn them over. It was quite an experience.
So
I was there in 2004.
they still don't know? Like the grandkids don't know about Tilly?
That is correct.
How is that possible? She's your age. You've not told her? Oh, Penina's not here anymore.
Nina died.
But didn't you ever tell her?
Tell whom?
Penina.
Nina knew, but she wouldn't tell.
She didn't tell her children,
Right,
but my generation.
right.
Why?
When you were, when the Nazis came in and said your family moved to a shack in the outskirts of the city, was that part of like a ghetto thing, or was?
No.
Or
It was about to become, and that's when we were able to leave, when my mother arranged for us to leave. But you see, my uncle, whose wife was murdered in Bucharest, he stayed and somehow was able to survive. You could pay your way and all that, and people that were not lucky went to Transnistria, which is another story. And by the way, my stepfather, he was a philatelist. He was the president of the Judaica Society of Canada. He had a lot of articles, which I'll be glad to share with you, about Transnistria and what happened, which is another story entirely, and those people really suffered and many of them died. And talking about that, which is entirely different, they knew I was from Romania while I was in Atlanta, and somebody here in Augusta, children wanted to know what their grandfather who emigrated from Romania in the First World War was doing here in Georgia. So they asked me, and I found an au pair here from Romania because my Romanian is not that great. So she translated it. And you expected that the guy would write the diary and all that about his experiences while working in Augusta, Georgia. He was inducted into the military, Romanian military, in the First World War, and the Jews were being discriminated, of course, and beaten up. So many of them ran away, and the soldiers would come to Jewish homes at that time, looking for those Jewish guys that escaped. And that's what he said. They would use bayonets, go open the closet to see if somebody's hiding over there, and he escaped. So everything that he said had to do with his terrible experiences in Romania during the First World War. And I have that, I have the translation.
And how did you, when you were in Austria by yourself and independent, how did you choose Canada, and how did you were able to get in?
Oh, very simple. I tried to get into the States, they wouldn't give me a visa, so that's why I had to marry my wife later to be able to do that. But Canada accepted me. So, you know, I will tell you more. My father was very wise. My father Gustav was very wise. The reason I wanted to come to the States because my father invested a small sum of money in the Chase Bank in 1935, and I wasn't going to be able to get to it until I was 21. So you can understand that I desperately wanted to go into the States.
Were you ever able to get that money?
Oh yes, I could prove it. So, yeah. And I never thought about what I described to you for quite a while. I was always busy working and all that. And, well, I'm a member of Beth Jacobs, so at one time or another they asked me, because they got three of us, different time periods, to speak about our experiences. And I was the one that goes back the longest time, because I arrived there in 44 and left in 56. Other people spoke about other times. So that kind of started me on that. And I'm also a member of Hemshech, you know what that is. Yeah. Not much to say. I mean, my experience in Israel was generally very good. I met with kids that were from Nekba, which was being bombed by the Egyptian army. Katznelson, who was a famous poet in Israel, and you know, I knew some of the people early times. And when we were in Tel Aviv, we lived around the corner. In that one room, we lived around the corner from where David Ben-Gurion and his wife lived. Yes, please.
Okay. Why did you finally decide to speak to us, like for your first group, right?
Why did I decide to come
Yeah,
here?
like why did you decide to speak?
I was invited.
Oh, you
No, but I think her question is that you generally have not spoken publicly.
No, I was invited.
That's her
Actually, the
question.
Bremen, thank you. The Bremen asked me to be one of the docents. And you know something? I never did it. And the reason for that is because, guess what? I still work. I'm still employed part-time. And I just cannot be there during the day, and that I never did that. But you know something? There is a group in Washington, D.C. I know that I'm digressing, but it's all related. There's a group in Washington, D.C., which is a Jewish group, and they invite African-American kids, high schoolers like you, to come on a trip to visit Martin Luther King, but also they go to Camp Rama in, you know what Camp Rama is, and they take them around so that they find out what Jewish kids are doing and all that. So these kids stay with the hotel that I'm at when they come to Atlanta. And in the morning, before they go on their trip, I'm being asked to talk a little bit about some of the things that we discussed over here. So I didn't go to the Bremen, but I do some of that.
What are your thoughts on anti-Semitism that is still happening there?
Well, my son, who lives in New Jersey and works in Manhattan, and I have a lot of discussions regarding that. He is very, very upset about what is going on with the Congress. In Congress right now, the two Muslim members of Congress. And I'm more concerned about snide remarks that people are making in everyday life. So I think it's pretty bad. You know, I was at one time the director of catering of the Marriott downtown here in Atlanta, long before you were born. So I was the director of catering, and the director of sales all there always had the responsibility for the diary, because rooms, when you sell rooms, you make a lot more money than when you sell banquets, regardless. So I booked a very large Jewish organization when the Marriott was empty, had all these rooms for sale. And I was so angry. And I walked into his room, into his office, and I said to him, well, you know, I said, you always say that I'm only good for the Jews. Here, we sold it for the convention. So I pay them back, but not by saying you are wrong and all that. Try to prove it to them that they are wrong, and they will remember that for a very long time if you can make that kind of a point. I think today, where I work with a lot of Muslims, and we get along very well. And I can't tell you what their thoughts are when they go home, but it is my belief that they act the same when they're home as they are when they're around me.
We've just about run out of time, so we want to thank you for coming, and especially for us being one of your first major presentations. It was fabulous. Thank you so much. And thank you all for your moral
Thank you.
support.
Thank you guys, that was very sweet.
And those of you going on vacation or to camp, enjoy the summer.
Hold on.
And
We're gonna go.
good luck to those of you who graduate and go to school.
You have grandparents.
Oh, what?
You have
Okay,
grandparents,
we're
yes?
done.
Oh,
Thank you,
one,
folks.
yeah.
Oh, just one?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
I see her a lot. She makes up for it.
that's beautiful.
Just hold up. All right, so here's one.